So after your residency, you went to Germany for 4 years?
Well, after the internship. I hadn't had a residency.
Oh, okay. Okay, so you did a 15-month internship.
Yeah.
And then were over in Germany.
And then I had to go on active duty because, you know, the Army during the war, when the war started, I was in college in 41, and anybody who was in medical pre-med, the Army did not want to have them leave because they needed the physicians later on. So they pretty much did not let us be drafted or volunteer for other services. And finally, Secretary of War Stimson, it wasn't wholly agreed to by Eisenhower, but he gave in. Stimson thought that the students in college who were studying for engineering, law, or any major should be allowed to continue despite the war, and they formed a division of the Army called the Army Specialized Training Program, the ASTP. There were about 180,000 of us across the country, every college and medical school. And we were PFCs, we were in the Army, and they sent us. But after the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower had lost many more men than he thought he would. And in January of 45, his replacements were gone, were used up. And he said, send the ASTP immediately. So within a couple of weeks, every college, university, all of the AST boys were on the boats and over. Except, he said, the 30,000 medical students. Well, we did not, but for every year that you went to medical school, you had to serve a year on active duty. So it worked out that I had 4 years of medical school. So I served 4 years. I got home in 1949.
And then what did you do?
Well, after I had when I first got back, I was on a surgical service at the Veterans Hospital, and that's where I met Lamar Suda. Dr. Suda was a well-known surgeon in Boston at the time. He was the head of the blood banking. He started blood banking in the whole state of Massachusetts. He was the head of the blood bank. During the war, he was a doctor for the paratroops. He had parachuted behind the lines at the D-Day. He was quite a hero to most people. But he was I never knew that until later on. Somebody told me about it. He never would say anything. But for about a year in the VA, I assisted him and was with him. And then I got the residency, decided to go into urology, and got the residency at Boston City. And I went into practice in Boston after I finished. I had an office on Commonwealth Avenue, as I remember, 260, I believe. And I lived in Hyde Park. And I didn't particularly care for the lifestyle at the time because you had to, in Boston, you had to start in a lot of hospitals, and you were in the car all the time going from one place to another. And when you get back to your office, there was no place to park. If you were the lower echelon, just starting, they didn't let you have a parking spot. That was reserved for the seniors. So anyway, what killed me one day was a long day, and I wanted to get home. And I drove up Commonwealth. I got to Kenmore Square to go to home. Red Sox leaving out, and that happened every day during the summer. And when the game was over, the traffic. So my chief at Boston City called me one day, and he said, a friend of his in Worcester at St. Vincent Hospital, the chief urology at St. Vincent's, was a man by the name of Dr. Steele. And there was only one other man in urology at the hospital at the time, a young man. His name was Dr. Bergen. And he went to a medical meeting one time in, I think it was 1953, I guess. And he was sitting there, he had two residents with him, and they were in a car wreck in front of Norton's. They were hitting their car. You know that big eagle in front of Norton's? They hit it. And Dr. Bergen was killed. He was 39. And so when I came up to Worcester and I saw Dr. Steele and the doctors there, and St. Vincent's was the only new hospital in Massachusetts since before the war. It had just been finished. Hard to believe. They moved out of it already. But it was brand new. And it had some people there that really, at that time in history, were outstanding. For instance, there was a Dr. Paul Ware, probably one of only 50 cardiac surgeons in the whole country. And he was he wanted to do cardiac, this is 1954. And the head of the hospital had okayed his getting a heart pump, and they had a very good research group, and it was a very progressive place. For instance, the only hospital that had in those days, psychiatry was in the state hospital. It's the first hospital built with a psychiatric unit for inpatients. Plus a lot of other things that really, it's a dynamic place. So I decided to move. And I'm always glad I have. It's been, St. Vincent's in those days was the major hospital in Worcester. In size, certainly, and in its activities. And I've enjoyed my stay at St. Vincent's very much. We tended in those days to be rather insular. We did not mix in the other hospitals at all. I knew the doctors on the memorial staff, and only through the medical society I had met them, but not any other way. We never had meetings together. Each hospital sort of, and that way it had been for years. One of the great things that the medical school did for us was to, in order for us to, like in urology, to have teaching things for the students and the residents and so forth, we had to come together. We had to have somebody who was going to, Dr. Wheeler was our chief of surgery, but as soon as the medical school was ready, and he left St. Vincent's, but he appointed Dr. Costantian at Hahnemann as the professor of urology, and Dr. Scherer at Memorial, and the rest of us were on the, and then we had to meet together in each hospital every month, had a program, and it was a much more interesting, that happened about 1970, I think. So the medical school immediately increased our interest in education. There was a lot of people at the time who didn't want the school here, not the school so much, but the hospital, because they felt it would be another competitor, and Worcester had too many hospitals, too many beds. But right after the war, there was no worry about finances. And you know, in 1964, President Johnson, he wanted the Medicare program very badly. And that's where his fatal flaw, I think, because they tacked on Medicaid at the last moment, and the people who pushed Medicaid said that it would be for mothers and children of medically indigent people, and it would only cost $1 billion a year. They voted it in, and in order to satisfy certain economic situations, I remember my brother-in-law, who was a politician in Boston at the time, he showed me the bill and he said, it's got this fatal flaw. And I said, what is that? He says, there's no control on the finances. The fees to the hospitals and the doctors were to be usual and customary. And I said, what's wrong with that? So he says, economically, a government cannot afford an over-ending, and he says it's going to come to, it would take a few years, and of course it did. The crash came in I think we really hit the wall there was a lot of problems in the mid-70s, but 1979, I think, was when the government said we can't handle it anymore. I think that by that time the cost of Medicare was $1 billion a day. Massachusetts was almost bankrupt from Medicaid. So they had to, and that's when they looked around for a different way of paying. And I forget the doctor at the Harvard School of Public Health worked on it, the DRG, diagnostic related. So there was some handle on the outflow of money. But it is too bad that medicine got so involved then with government regulations and certificate of need. If you wanted to build something, you had to get the government to agree to it. In the days when I first came to St. Vincent's, the superintendent of the hospital was a very wonderful nun by the name of Sister Mary Loretto. After a while, I guess she got promoted to Mother Mary Loretto. But I know that in Boston, if you wanted to get new equipment and you had to go through a committee and present what you needed. Then they would decide what they would budget and so forth. So I remember asking the chief of urology, Dr. Steele, I said, I like to use a certain type of cystoscope in doing my cystoscopy work. that I had been used to in my residency. So I said, who do I make the application to? He says, what do you mean application? I said, the purchasing committee or whatever. He said, we don't have such a thing. He said, you just knock on Mother's door and you tell her what you want. And I said, well, what will she say? Well, she thinks you got a good idea there, and she'll say yes, and that's it. You'll have it tomorrow. So if she doesn't want to, you'll have the answer today, not yes or no. And that was the way things ran in Worcester in those days. I believe in all the other hospitals. She was the power that bought you, and Dr. Ware wanted I forget this hot pump machine he was preparing to use. I was $10,000 or $15,000. She okayed it, thought she could see that it was going to be important to the hospital. And then he started on a laboratory. He got a whole crew together, anesthesiologists and nurses, and they worked in the dog laboratory, the Witt Memorial in Tatnick Square, perfecting, the machine. And I think he did his first case in 1957. It's probably the only community hospital in America that did open heart surgery. It was valve surgery. So how things change. Dr. Ware, in 1965, unfortunately, developed a cardiomyopathy. It's strange, isn't it, that here's a man who needed a heart, cardiac surgeon, and he died, 51 years of age. So here we have this cardiac ability, but the superintendent had changed. And the next sister in charge, she was convinced that he had done all the valves and that there was no future. Now, this was 1965. 4 years later, at Cleveland Clinic, Mason develops cardiac catheterization, and that Argentinian cardiac started the coronary bypass operation. St. Vincent's never got back into the cardiac surgery until 1985. It took 20 years. And I remember always telling them, I thought that we ought to become affiliated with the University of Massachusetts heart program. That was the only way it was going to work. And that's what finally happened. But a first-rate hospital today obviously needs that ability. Any other questions about it?
Let's see. When you first started practicing in Worcester, when you first came here to Worcester, what was a typical day like for you?
Well, in those days, I would come to the hospital about 7:30, and we made rounds. I had an orderly who had a cart with all sorts of things. We go around and see the patients. And then after rounds, I would go to this cystoscopy room in the operating room and spend my mornings doing bladder examinations, kidney x-rays. In those days, of course, we had x-ray, but we didn't have any of the other. We were still using rather ancient methods that took time. I always surprised my son at localizing stones in the aorta. Nowadays they put the dye up and they have a fluoroscope, but it was all by feel. And trying to distinguish between a tumor and a stone. The ancient method, probably as old as you young who started urology, is the nurse would light a wax can, and I'd have my catheter. She'd light the wax, and we get a drop of wax drop on, and I'd spin it, and I'd have a fusiform. Let the wax dry. It'd be smooth, you see, very nice. Let it dry well. Then I would introduce it to the aorta, go beyond and I would turn it as I took it out. And if it was a stone, it would scratch it. If it was a tumor, no. But anyway, that's how we identify. That's a very ancient. We did it. We did have the X-ray ability, and so following the cystoscopy session, I might then have patients who had been admitted with prostate problems, and which I did, or kidney tumors. Then we do the operations, and in those days the surgical residents would rotate through urology, and we would do the cases. After surgery, I had lunch at the hospital and went downtown to my office on 290 Main, I think it was. Yeah, doctors were, I must say, treated extremely well in those days. We had a much higher standing, I think, than is happening today. For instance, all the senior surgeons would, even the Fallon Clinic was downtown before they moved to Institute Road. The Fallon Clinic only composed of 2 or 3 men. But we had, I think the name of the place was the U.S. Garage. And they would drive us to our office, especially if it was raining, and pick us up afterwards. Well, that's pretty good service. Huh? Imagine getting that today. So the office would go on until we're seeing patients. Dr. Steele and I were practicing together at that time. Probably finish up around 5 o'clock, 5:30. I didn't like to, I always wanted to be home for supper with my children. Otherwise, I would never see them. So I always made it a point to not have office hours beyond 5 o'clock.
What do you think it was like for your family to have you as a physician? And what was that like for them?
Well, I think in a way they didn't see a lot of me. I'm afraid I was, even Saturday and Sunday. And what we do in those days, in order to have some time with them, I'd take my older boys and some of the girls to the hospital on Sunday. And when I'm making rounds, they were, sister would give them the chalkboard and other things, And so they spent a lot, whether they liked it or not, a lot of time. And that was not only myself, but Dr. McCann and all of the other men who had younger children at the time. That was a common thing in those days for us to bring them around to them. And I always made it a point when I went to a medical meeting, it might last 4 or 5 days, you know, either in New York or I would rotate among the children. They always came with us, my wife and I. So that was another way of spending time with them. But I think we did devote most of our time to the practice. I think it was much more labor intensive in those days. A lot more open surgery that we do today. Exploratory operations, which are just unheard of now. Because we get an x-ray, we wouldn't know whether a kidney shadow was a cyst or a tumor or what it was. Huh? We had no way of, even needling things was not a... And so we would operate to, and if it was a cyst, we'd drain it and that would be it. Now, you know, now for the last, since we've had CT scans and all that sort of thing, that eliminated all of that. And the advances in surgery alone is making it simpler, don't you think? What are the laparoscopic things? Now, my son Bob was telling me the other day, he went over to Paris a few weeks ago to attend 2 French urologists in 2 different hospitals who do laparoscopic radical prostatectomy. If you could, and Bob said actually the laparoscopic approach with the big screen with that digital picture that you can see things so much better. And he said the whole thing looks like something out of the 21st century. This doctor has designed his own, since he's going to be operating looking at a thing, he's almost reclining. And he has this, anyway, I think that our physicians, our surgeons now, at least in urology, a lot of the advances in surgical technique are taking place not in America because of litigious problems. Marburger, the great urologist in Vienna, he comes to our meetings. He speaks English very well. And he's, maybe people have decided to go along with him, but small lesions in the kidney, let's say in the epipole, a very tiny tumor found by CAT scan when they're looking for something else. He doesn't think that we should be so radical as remove the whole kidney. He'll retain as much as the kidney that he can by being sure it didn't have any. Well, I'm not sure, since I'm not in the practicing now, but when we first heard that, maybe 10 years more ago, you know, a lot of American surgeons, what was their first thought? Well, suppose we do that. It's not the common way to do it. And suppose the patient does have a problem, recurrence. We are liable. So whether the urologists of today are are saving kidneys, as Marburger thinks we should. Marburger, and I don't know these two doctors in Paris that he went to see. He told me their names, but I couldn't remember them. And then my other son, Michael, went over with Dr. in Lyon, France, about 10 years ago, who developed the microwave therapy for benign prostatic hypertrophy, the microwave machine. And he brought it to the Mayo Clinic and got the federal government to test it, and it worked very well. They worked on it for about 5 years. The French doctor's name was Devoniac. And I guess it's a standard treatment today. I know they have one in Memorial. And it's wonderful for patients who are poor risk and that sort of thing. I was very proud of Michael getting that into the armamentarium.
So it sounds like that over the years, technology, especially in the field of urology, has incredibly changed how urology is practiced.
Oh, incredible.
Do you think the types of diseases or the types of problems you see have changed in that time?
Well, I think the greatest change I saw, over the years, and I don't have any explanation for it, back in the 50s and 60s, we had a lot of children starting about age 3 with severe urinary tract infections and pyelonephritis and all that sort of thing. And we in those days were examining them for reflux and all. And there were a lot of kids, and that sort of has disappeared, or not disappeared, but the numbers don't seem to be, whether they are better handled now by the pediatricians early in the game. But certainly there's been a great change in that. So we don't have hardly any pediatric beds in hospitals now, except for when they go in for surgery. Whereas St. Vincent's in the 50s and 60s had about 40 beds in a pediatric ward. That's gone. I think the prostatic treatment of prostatic hypertrophy and cancer of the prostate has changed tremendously since in my day, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, certainly 50s, 60s, maybe we didn't have as old a population, but cancer of the prostate was a rare disease, sort of. I'll give you a figure. When I was in the Army, Colonel, he was at the Walter Reed. And now when we examined the older officers every year, and their annual physical, if we found any abnormal prostatic nodules, we would, no matter where in the world it was, you would fly the man to the urologist at the Walter Reed. So he was gathering many patients. And between 1940 and 1950, that 10-year period, where he probably did more, he probably saw more cancer of the prostate than most people, as he saw more testicular cancer, because he was a younger. But anyhow, he did a total of 56 radical prostatectomies for cure in 10 years. This is a man who's looking to treat it. So 56. I think UMass does 56 in a month, it seems to be, because it's such a commonly discovered, all because of the PSA testing. Because it develops over so many years. I think we're just picking them up earlier and curable. And those are the big changes. One other I thought was so dramatic in my time was, of course, the two testicular cancer, especially the embryonal cells, and the Wilms tumor in children, which is not a terribly common disease, but I had a child. It seemed to me at those days, if you found the Wilms tumor after the child was a year old, the mortality was almost 100%. If you did your nephrectomy, and the same with testicular in young men. Wyland Ledbetter at the Mass General, who I knew well at that time, we didn't have chemotherapy. What a change that made. The most successful chemotherapy, it's been in Wilms and testicular cancer, because the mortality rate in testicular used to be, I think, from Brown, 85, 90%. Now it's almost 80% cure. Same way with Wilms, it's a turnaround, and it's only because the chemotherapy came in and X-ray treatment, those two, so it's a combination now of surgery, chemo, and X-ray, and the cure rate's that's been the big change that I've seen for the good.
When you started practicing in Worcester, do you think all the patients that needed care or needed care in urology were able to get it?
Well, don't forget, we had in every hospital what they call, it was a free ward, or what was called house patient. Mm-hmm. Somebody who couldn't afford either, and the only insurance was usually Blue Cross Blue Shield. In St. Vincent's, there was a fairly large ward of patients who were really the chief residence patients in surgery, or the chief resident in urology. He had to present all his cases to the visiting surgeon or visiting urologist as to how he was going to treat them, and usually he operated with the senior surgeon. And all of that time and effort was part of your hospital appointment. And of course, that disappeared with when Medicare came in. And the ward disappeared because it was supposed to make everybody able to have care and so forth. But I think Medicaid helped, but there's still a lot of uninsured people. I think the worst people, not the worst, but unfortunately is a man who ran a small businessman. And that's why Frank Carroll in Worcester had a great organization. It's a small business. He could get all those individuals together into groups, and so they could get health coverage. But still, it was an expense that a lot of them could not. I think it's true today. I'm not certain of that, but a lot of them I don't think have insurance. It's too expensive.
Do you think it's easier or harder for people today to get care than it used to be?
But from what as I say, I've been out of it for a few years, but the care is there have been a lot of obstacles put up for the individual to the managing of care. Patients years ago, before all of the government and so forth, they would probably make poor choices in some respects, where they would not go to their primary and they just go right to a specialist. And that's what the managed care whole idea was too. And that was first brought up in President Nixon's, I think the first HMO legislation was in his time, trying to get a handle on the costs. So from what you hear from patients nowadays, they seem to be very unhappy with the gatekeeper principle. They feel that the doctor didn't send them to the specialist when he didn't think they needed to go and all that sort of thing. I suppose many of those people will say, yes, it's harder to get care.
So how has managed care influenced your practice in particular? How did managed care influence your practice? How did it affect your practicing? And do you think it's been a positive influence on healthcare?
Well, I think as the HMO programs grew and grew, you know, one of the things that was an eye-opener at St. Vincent's Hospital was the rapidity of the growth of Fallon, which was one of the first in the business way back. They were the first to take advantage of Senator Kennedy's HMO to start the senior program. They had a very good one. It was very successful. The first year, even Dr. Podbelski, who died recently, who was the president of Fallon for a long time, he's a good friend of mine. He told me the first year they had the Medicare senior plan, which Dr. Myers always, the HMO part of it, they thought it was going to be 10% of their overall. Much to their surprise, it was 90% of their work. In fact, they became, and of course they used St. Vincent's, they overwhelmed St. Vincent's because they controlled most of the patients. And then, so they merged with St. Vincent's. If they went from 2 or 3 doctors in 1970 with about 80 people to 150,000 and 200 doctors. So that was a great eye-opener. How does it affect my practice? Well, patients would come to me and say, I have Blue Cross and Blue Shield, doctor, but it's gotten so expensive. And at work, they are now offering Harvard, Tufts, and and I can join the Fallon at a much lower rate. And what could I say? I would say it's a choice that you have to make. If you have Blue Cross and Blue Shield, you can go anywhere, any hospital. But if you sign up with a HMO and it's a managed care, you've given up some of the ability to move around. That's all. But at any rate, obviously patients liked the savings, and so they flocked in. In 1978, I never was part of Fallon. I was an independent working at their hospital. And I never wanted to. It was just not something that I was used to. I came from a different era. So I never joined, although in later years, when the Fallon got very busy, they would send patients to you. Just, you can be a Fallon affiliate, I guess it was. But in '78, they formed a competing HMO, which was what is called an IPA, an Independent Practice Association. It's called a Central Mass. And the way it worked is that we all contributed money to start it, but we stayed in our own offices. We didn't have a central. And that worked quite well. We could compete in some respects with the HMOs until some few years ago, the board of directors decided to sell it to another HMO, which has been happening all over this country, these mergers and what have you. And that's about the time I retired anyway, so I don't know what the situation is now. They sent back, in the settlement, the startup funds that we put in 1978, whatever number of doctors it was. Yeah, they sent that back. I think we had about 800 or so, all over Worcester County, in this IPA. So I didn't see a great change in the practice, because you could also you couldn't belong. For instance, there were restrictions. If you went to St. Vincent's and that was your main, you could not bring a Tufts plan patient there, so you weren't allowed to be on a Tufts plan. Or I think Harvard. You'd have to be on the UMass or Memorial. So those were some of the problems that occurred with the rise of HMO medicine. And then of course, the people who ran the HMOs were trying to get a handle on everything, and they, which I remember one time I got a call from one of the HMOs, and the young lady said to me, "How many symptoms from table A does the patient have, and how many from table B?" And I said, "Column B." I said, "Well, you got me. What is this?" So she said, "Well, we sent." So I went up. My secretary gave me this. Column A was, in order to admit the patient to have a prostate operation, he must have 2 symptoms from column A and at least 1 from column B. I said, do you frequent the Chinese restaurants or something? I can't understand this. I said, suppose the man has in column B acute retention. He doesn't have anything from column, he just went into retention. You mean he can't come to the hospital and be relieved? Well, that was the sort of thing that I think it got a little ridiculous. That's pretty well, I guess, gone, because I think the doctors more or less got rid of that by just laughing at it. But this is what they wanted to evidently have you certify every time. But I think that was a little far.
Just as we're wrapping this up, what advice would you give to physicians starting out today?
Well, I am still, if I had to advise even another son of mine, I would say medicine is a great and wonderful profession. And despite all its problems, when it comes down to it, it's the doctor and one patient, eventually. And you learn over the years, you meet thousands of people, you get a great feel for the, various way they feel and all the rest of it. If you listen to them, you get a lot of information. And the one great thing I miss about not being in practice is that daily meeting them and hearing their stories, some of them fantastic. And I think the future, with all these technology, and it'll be a wonderful future for medicine, especially if, I started out, we had no antibiotics. I remember at the Boston City, we had a real sick person with septicemia, and actually we couldn't do much for them. We'd give them fluids and sunshine and fresh air is what they used, and aspirin. But then the penicillin came in, and then when the war started, the Army took it all. There was no penicillin for the, except a certain number of controlled in every area of the country. New England was controlled by Dr. Chester Kiefer of Boston University Medical School. He was a great infectious disease person. And if you had a case that was really desperate, and I had that occasion several times, he was really a wonderful man. You'd call him up, and he would come to the hospital, see the patient, and if he agreed, he would say, well, I'll issue 10,000 units a day. I mean, just minute amounts. And we were astounded because it worked so well. Of course, it doesn't do that anymore, but initially, and to show how desperate the civilian people were for antibiotics. When I was in the Army, I was the chief of surgery at the 319 station in Bremerhaven. And there was a big German hospital up the street, St. Joseph's. And the infectious disease doctor came down one day, very nice German man, and he said, doctor, and in this broken English, he got across to me that we were wasting a lot of penicillin. And I said, how? Well, we had a ward of 30 or 40 men who were admitted for venereal disease, gonorrhea, and so forth, the whole business. He said, I propose I want to get that penicillin back, and I'll use it on my patients. We need penicillin. So I said, well, how do you do that? He said, well, I'll set up the thing, and he had the patients agree. It was a big container, and they would void, all of them void into this big can. And every day he would collect it. He told me he got 90% of the penicillin back. They reconstitute it and then work it again, because it doesn't disintegrate. I was amazed. But at any rate, I never heard of that again. But I hope he didn't tell his patients where he got it. But at any rate, that's what he did. So penicillin was the big. But anyway, get back to what I would say. I would strongly urge anybody who. I'd have no regrets. Some doctors say I wouldn't want my children to go into medicine now because it's this or that. But I never felt that way. In fact, two of my boys went into medicine and became urologists, so I'm very pleased about that.
Made you feel good, yeah.
Huh?
It must have made you feel good.
Felt very good. My son Michael was just appointed the Alden Cook Endowed Professorship of Urology at the Mayo Medical School, and he's the chairman of the department, so he's done very well with his career in urology. I see in the paper yesterday, the U.S. World Report said that the list of best hospitals in America, Johns Hopkins 1, Mayo Clinic 2, and Mass General 3. I don't know how they arrive at that, but so yeah, I would be very happy if anybody took my advice about going into medicine. I wonder if you noticed in the paper yesterday about the number of physicians across the country who are leaving medicine and going into biotech companies or into industry. Did you see that article?
I didn't see that article, but someone else mentioned it.
Yeah, it was amazing. Deciding that it's not worth their time to do a residency that might make them work 80 hours a week, and they would go and become, you know, Stanford has a program where you can get an MBA and an MD. Brown, I think, too.
I think Tufts has that program.
Tufts has that program. So there may be...
There's more of a business feel towards medicine now, I think.
That'll give you some idea that the business part of medicine, yeah. Do they have classes in any on the business part of medicine?
Not here.
Not here, but a lot of places do, and I think it's very encouraged, actually.
You ought to know what you're getting, how you're getting into it, yeah.
Thank you so much.
So you're